Solomon, the son of David and Bathsheba, was born with the promise of bringing peace and prosperity to the people of Israel. His very name, which means peace, carried a weight of hope and redemption. As the second child of a troubled relationship marked by sin and repentance, he was born into a context of forgiveness and restoration. From a young age, Solomon was destined for greatness, something that would exceed even his father David's expectations. Coming from a royal family, Solomon grew up in an environment full of challenges and learning experiences. The palace where he was raised was a stage for disputes and betrayals. His older brothers, Amnon and Absalom, caused great turmoil in the kingdom, shaping how Solomon would later view power and the responsibility of governing. As he witnessed the mistakes and failures of his own family, he carried the desire to be a different king, one who would bring true justice and peace to his people. When David was on his deathbed, another threat emerged. Solomon's brother, Adonijah, tried to seize the throne, declaring himself king. However, with the quick intervention of the prophet Nathan and his mother Bathsheba, Solomon was crowned as the rightful heir. He became king of Israel amidst a whirlwind of intrigues, but with his heart set on following the path his father had taught him. His reign began with a promise to be faithful to God and rule with wisdom. Upon ascending the throne, Solomon received a clear mission from his father. On his deathbed, David advised him, "Follow the ways of the Lord, obey his decrees and commandments, so that you may prosper in all you do." 1 Kings 2 verses 2-3. This was the most valuable advice Solomon could have received, a true map for a successful reign. And in the early years of his rule, he showed a willingness to honor that guidance, seeking God in all his decisions. At the beginning of his reign, Solomon seemed promising, a young king with his heart turned toward God. He started his journey with wisdom and a genuine desire to serve the Lord. But, as the story reveals, the path of a leader is full of pitfalls, and even the best beginnings can be derailed by the choices made along the way. Solomon's start was glorious, but the end of his story would be marked by decisions that led him away from his true mission. Solomon began his reign with his heart devoted to God. One of his first acts as king was to seek the Lord's presence in prayer. The Bible tells us that he loved God and followed the decrees of his father, David. However, there was one detail that marked his worship. He offered sacrifices on high places, a common practice, but one that indicated a certain lack of centralization in worship to God. Nevertheless, his desire to please the Lord was clear. In one of those moments of devotion, God appeared to Solomon in a dream at Gibeon. On that occasion, the Lord made him an offer few would have the wisdom to answer correctly. "Ask for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." Solomon, with humility and discernment, did not ask for riches, power, or the death of his enemies. Instead, he prayed for wisdom to govern the people of Israel justly. This request showed how committed he was to being a good king focused on the well-being of his people. God was so pleased with Solomon's request that, in addition to granting him unparalleled wisdom, he also gave him riches and honor, things the young king had not asked for. The Lord promised that as long as Solomon walked in his ways and obeyed his commandments, he would have a long and prosperous life. This divine promise laid the foundation for a reign that seemed destined to be one of the most glorious in Israel's history. Solomon quickly stood out for his wisdom. He became famous for his ability to discern complex situations, like the famous case of the two women who disputed the maternity of a child. That judgment, in which Solomon suggested dividing the baby in half to reveal the true mother, not only demonstrated his intelligence but also solidified his reputation as a just leader. The news of his wisdom spread to neighboring nations, and kings and queens from distant lands came to hear his counsel. In the early years of his reign, Solomon appeared to strictly follow God's ways. His wisdom and discernment were a reflection of his quest for divine justice. He built the famous temple in Jerusalem, an extraordinary achievement symbolizing God's presence among the people of Israel. However, as we will see later, not even the greatest wisdom and wealth could protect Solomon from the temptations that would later test his faith and loyalty to the Lord. Solomon quickly distinguished himself with his immense wisdom, a blessing that God had given him in response to his humble prayer. He became the wisest man of his time, perhaps the wisest who ever lived. His wisdom extended beyond judicial matters. Solomon understood the laws of nature, politics, administration, and the complexities of the human soul. His knowledge was so vast that kings and queens from afar came to consult him, including the famous Queen of Sheba, who was astounded by the wealth and wisdom of the king. In addition to his wisdom, Solomon was blessed with immeasurable wealth. God rewarded him not only with unique discernment but also with material prosperity. He built a grand empire, amassing treasures and resources that surpassed any other king of his time. Lavish palaces, enormous stables with thoroughbred horses, and a powerful navy marked his reign as a period of great opulence. Solomon lived surrounded by luxury, enjoying every comfort the world could offer. The pinnacle of his achievements was the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. This majestic structure, envisioned by his father David, was brought to life with all the wealth and resources Solomon's kingdom could provide. The temple, made of cedar and gold, became the ultimate symbol of God's presence in Israel. The dedication of the temple was a significant moment in his reign, with Solomon offering a fervent and sincere prayer, asking God to bless the people of Israel and keep his eyes on that sacred place. Despite all this greatness, Solomon could not escape the internal challenges that come with power and wealth. While his wisdom helped him govern justly, his wealth began to distance him from the principles he had followed earlier in his life. Luxury and power can be a blessing when used with discernment, but without vigilance, they can also become spiritual traps. Solomon, even with all his wisdom, was not immune to the temptations that success brings. Solomon's prosperity, instead of strengthening him spiritually, began to create a gap between him and God. The king who once asked only for wisdom began to indulge in wealth as an end in itself. This imbalance between the spiritual and material world would soon open the doors to the failures that would mark the second half of his reign, revealing that wisdom and wealth, when not accompanied by obedience to God, can become a dangerous snare. If you're enjoying this story and recognize the importance of seeking wisdom and balance in your life, just as Solomon did at the beginning of his reign, this is the perfect moment to keep learning. The wisdom God offered Solomon is available to all of us, as long as we have open hearts to receive it. Imagine how much your life could prosper by applying principles like these in your everyday life. Solomon's life is a real lesson on how wisdom can transform not only our future but also the lives of those around us. If you want to grow spiritually, prosper in your projects, and live with discernment, I invite you to subscribe to the Divine Prosperity channel. Here, we explore biblical stories and offer practical teachings to help you live a fuller life aligned with divine purpose. Give this video a like if you believe wisdom is one of the greatest riches we can attain. It's not enough just to have knowledge, you need to know how to apply it at the right time and in the right way. Solomon's story shows that, with God's wisdom, we can overcome any challenge, but it also reminds us to be aware of the temptations life presents. Are you seeking wisdom to make important decisions? Are you facing challenges and unsure which path to take? Activate notifications to make sure you don't miss any of our videos, where we share more teachings about prosperity and how to achieve a life full of purpose. Here, you'll find the right content to strengthen your spiritual journey. Now, how about watching the next video, where we dive deeper into how to avoid the traps that led Solomon off course? Let's continue together on this journey of learning and transformation. Don't wait for later, what can start now. The right knowledge at the right time can change your life forever. As the years passed, Solomon's heart began to drift from the path he had once followed at the start of his reign. His first major mistake was becoming involved with foreign women, something God had clearly forbidden for the kings of Israel. Many of these marriages were political, aimed at forging alliances with other nations, but they also brought severe spiritual consequences. His foreign wives introduced idolatry into Israel, leading Solomon himself to participate in pagan rituals. Solomon, who had once built the majestic temple for the Lord, was now erecting altars to foreign gods like Chemosh and Molech, who were worshipped with immoral practices and even human sacrifices. This moral decline not only offended God but also corrupted the hearts of the people of Israel. The kingdom, which had once flourished under divine blessing, began to suffer the consequences of its leader's spiritual downfall. Idolatry was just one symptom of a larger issue. Solomon's heart was no longer fully devoted to God. He, who had begun his reign asking for wisdom to rule justly, now found himself swayed by passions and the vanity that came with power and wealth. The same man who had written proverbs about the importance of seeking God above all else was now entangled in a web of decisions that distanced him from the Creator. God, who had appeared to Solomon twice, warned him about the consequences of his sins. However, the king did not listen. As a result, the Lord raised adversaries against him. Both internal and external enemies began to arise, and the kingdom of Israel, which had once been united and prosperous, started to fragment. God declared that because of Solomon's disobedience, the kingdom would be divided after his death, with only a portion left to his descendants, in respect to the covenant made with David. Solomon's decline serves as a warning about the dangers of straying from God's path. He, who had been the wisest and most blessed king, allowed pride and external influences to corrupt his heart. Even with all the wisdom he possessed, Solomon could not resist the temptations that led to his spiritual downfall. His decisions created a bitter legacy that divided the nation and brought sorrow to the rest of his life. At the end of his life, Solomon faced the consequences of his choices. God, faithful to his promises, did not leave the king's sins unpunished. As he had warned, the Lord began to raise enemies against Solomon. Among these adversaries was Jeroboam, who would later rebel and divide the kingdom of Israel, fulfilling the prophecy that the kingdom would be fragmented due to the king's idolatry and disobedience. This marked the beginning of a period of instability and conflict in the kingdom. Solomon, who had started his reign with such promise and prosperity, ended his days watching the decay of the kingdom he had built. He went from being a wise and God-fearing king to a ruler embittered by the realization that his choices had distanced the people from true faith. The idolatry he had allowed eroded the spiritual foundation of Israel, leaving a nation divided both internally and in its relationship with God. Solomon's sorrow is reflected in his own words in the book of Ecclesiastes. In this book, we see an aged man reflecting on the futility of many of his achievements. He declares that all he did under the sun was like chasing after the wind, a meaningless pursuit of pleasures and wealth that brought no real satisfaction. Ecclesiastes became a bitter testimony from a king who, though he had everything, lost the most important thing, his full relationship with God. What's most striking about Solomon's story is how, even as the wisest man in the world, he failed to follow his own advice. He wrote many proverbs about the importance of fearing God and avoiding the dangers of wealth and pride, yet he fell victim to these exact traps. His life teaches us that wisdom without obedience is insufficient to maintain a life of integrity before God. In the end, Solomon leaves us with one important lesson, that true happiness and purpose can only be found in a life dedicated to the Lord. All his wisdom and wealth could not save his soul from the consequences of sin. Solomon spent his final days burdened by the fact that he had strayed from God's path, and his reign, which began with such promise, ended in regret and loneliness. Solomon's legacy is a powerful warning of how drifting away from God can turn even the most promising of reigns into an example of sadness and regret. He, who was the wisest and most prosperous king of Israel, ended his life with a heavy heart, recognizing that all he had accomplished under the sun was, in fact, empty. True fulfillment, as he concluded in Ecclesiastes, can only be found in a life guided by God and his principles. Solomon left behind 3 books that reflect different phases of his life: Song of Solomon, which celebrates the love and joy of youth; Proverbs, which shares practical wisdom for a life of justice and righteousness; and Ecclesiastes, which reflects the disillusionment of a life lived without a deep relationship with the Creator. These writings are the testimony of a man who knew both the ecstasy of following God and the emptiness of straying from Him. And through these words, he continues to teach us today. The fact is that despite his mistakes, Solomon left an undeniable legacy of wisdom. Many of his proverbs still apply to modern life and help us understand how to live with wisdom, justice, and balance. However, his life reminds us that it is not enough to merely know the truth. It must be lived out every day, resisting the temptations the world offers and keeping our hearts firmly set on God. In the end, the most important advice Solomon gives us comes from the final words of Ecclesiastes: "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth," Ecclesiastes 12 verse 1. He invites us to seek God while we still have time, before the distractions and temptations of life lead us away from our divine purpose. Solomon knew that true happiness and fulfillment are found in a life of obedience and reverence to the Lord. Solomon's story doesn't just end with a warning but also with an opportunity. Just as he had the chance to seek God in his youth, we all have the opportunity to choose to live a life dedicated to Him. The question that remains is, are we willing to learn from Solomon's mistakes and seek true wisdom that comes from a deep relationship with the Creator?